Hey there, I'm Emily. I'm the dyer behind Emily Dyes Fiber, and today I am bringing you into my dye studio, such as it is, to show you how I dye my Blue Morpho colorway. Now I put dye studio in quotes because I'm a very, very small indie dyer just beginning, and as you may be able to tell by the background, I dye in my garage when my brother, who I live with, is at work and there's no car in this spot. So, let me show you what I have set up here. Right, so I have a big old table set up here that I do my dyeing on. For my heat source, I'm using, that is hot, I should not touch that. I'm using a 22-quart turkey roaster. It's not the most ideal heat source for dyeing, but I picked it because it's deep enough that I can do immersed dyeing and dip dyeing, and it's wide enough that I can do kind of low immersion, laid flat dyeing. In addition to that, I have my supplies. Over here I have my citric acid, my dye. This is a pretty simple colorway. It only has 3 colors in it. I use a turquoise, which is Saberset 480, a brilliant blue. So the turquoise is a more green blue, and this is more of a purpley blue. This one I use Wash Fast 490, and I use a black, which is Saberset 680. I would show you an example skein, but I'm actually dyeing this because I'm completely out, so I don't have any to show you. All of these are pre-mixed up in 1% dye solutions. I'm just giving them a quick little shake to make sure nothing went down to the bottom. I also have some plain water, and I've got my yarn soaking. This is 4 skeins of my merino sock base, which is a superwash merino nylon blend, so it'll take up the dye really quickly, and it's currently soaking in some warm water. I have it in warm water because it is really cold outside and I'm in the garage, and so I don't want it to go from like cold room temperature water into hot water and potentially felt. It is superwash, so it shouldn't be a big issue, but just in case. I also, because there is a hand-dyed section to this yarn, I have some of these. These are pieces from a clear shower curtain liner that I cut up and I use for steaming my yarn. So I'm going to steam that when I hand dye it. And then I just have some syringes to measure my dye, and gloves, and all of that usual stuff in like a junky shirt, so that way if I splash on myself, it's not that big of a deal. Okay, so my yarn is currently soaking, and I am currently heating up water to do the first of my dye. So when that gets done heating up, I will show you what I do next. Actually, before I get my yarn ready, I'm going to measure out the dye that I'm going to use. This colorway, I do 3 different dye passes. I do 1 low immersion, 1 at full immersion, and then 1 hand painting. So this is the dye I need for the low immersion. I have my dye stocks here. I have my syringes. So I'm going to mix up. This one's going to have brilliant blue in it, and this one's going to have brilliant blue and turquoise. This is pretty concentrated dye, and I'm actually going to want to spread it across a fair distance of the yarn. So I'm going to use some water. Alright, so my water that was heating up just finished heating up. So I'm going to go dump that into my turkey roaster and then show you what comes next. Okay, hopefully you can see this. I'm trying to keep you far enough away the camera doesn't fog up, but close enough that you can see it. That was my stuff falling off, no big deal. So this is my turkey roaster. In it I have some water. I boiled it in an electric teapot because that's the fastest way to get it up to temperature. But the roaster itself is set at around 220 degrees. And then if I can open this, I'm going to add... Okay, I confess the one thing that I don't measure, I measure all my dyes and everything, but I don't really measure my citric acid. I'm going to add probably about a teaspoon. And then wipe this measure out because it's all done in there. And then... give this sucker a stir to dissolve the citric acid. terrible clanging. Right, now I'm going to grab 2 of my 4 soaking skeins and put them in. Now when I put my skeins into soak, I do attach cotton strings onto them so that way I can grab hold of them and keep track of who's where. So, actually I lost that cotton string. One moment. Alright, let me try that again. I'm going to try to kind of spread these guys out. Inevitably, because this thing is not quite as big as I would like it to be, I have to do this sort of folding around motion. And then I'm going to kind of spread these out so that there's a nice even layer of yarn everywhere. And then, so my goal with this dyeing is I want this to be a very, very mottled yarn, and I want some of it to be more of a greeny blue with the turquoise and some of it to be more of a bluey blue with the blue. So in this first pass, I'm doing kind of a low immersion. It's not the lowest immersion, but a somewhat low immersion where I'm just going to kind of put these 2 dyes in splotches around. Kind of on a diagonal stripes, but not trying too hard. And then I'm going to rinse this out. And then rinse this out. And that way, I end up with an uneven dye, kind of a base layer. Some of it's going to be greener, some of it's going to be bluer. And then when I dye over it, any areas, because I'm going to dye over it with the yarn twisted, that will prevent the dye from reaching all of it. So I put this color down to begin with so that we don't end up with any spots with no dye on it. So I'm going to cover this guy and let it go for about half an hour and then be back to show you what I do next. Alright, so the water's basically clear. That means that all that dye's been soaked up. As you can see, there's kind of a swirly pattern on here. I'm trying to see if I can lift this without burning my hands so that you can kind of see. Right, so now I need to get this out of here so that I can do the next round. All right, so I see one of my strings. I'm just going to hang this over my spool. So I find, okay, so I've got, let me tilt this. So I got the string that this is on hooked over a spoon. I find that if I take a pair of tongs and I kind of rotate them like this, it'll actually squeeze out a lot of the water without needing to touch boiling hot yarn. Right. So as you can see, I've got some sections that are still white, some that are more of a blue, some that are more of a greeny blue, and that's what I want. I'm just going to set that to sit on a rack until it is ready for its second pass. Normally, if I were just dyeing one round of this, I would immediately go in and put it in for its second pass. However, because I'm trying to dye 4 skeins and I can only do 2 skeins in a round, it's going to have to sit for a little bit. Youch! Toasty. And here's a close-up of the skeins that are waiting for their next dye. As you can see, highly variable color, different tones. It's all good. I don't know if you can tell that they're actually steaming at the moment because they came out of a hot pot into a cold room. But so they're just going to sit for a half hour. I won't hurt them at all. It'll actually make it a little bit easier for me to handle them later because they won't be quite as hot. Right, now for the next stage I want more water in here. So I have got an electric kettle, which I was boiling some water at the end. It takes about 7 minutes to do, so I put it on about 7 minutes ago. Now I've got my water in, and I got water up to like here, so it's reasonably deep. Probably could be deeper, but it'll be fine. And I'm going to add my dye for this round. We're just going to add it straight in. That's 180 milliliters of Brilliant Blue. And give it a quick stir around. And as you can see, that's a pretty dark blue water. So now, before I put the yarn in that dye bath, I want to twist it up so it's got a little bit of a resist so that not all of this modeling that I've worked pretty hard to achieve gets completely over dyed with the blue. So what I'm going to do with these guys, I'm going to open them up here. And then I'm going to make like I'm going to twist it into a skein, but I'm only going to do a couple of twists because I don't want it too much of a resist either. Better go one more. Okay, it's been a while since I've done this on a wet skein, so let me try that again. 1, 2, 3 twists. Pull this over and then kind of encourage it around. Okay. So it's kind of like that. It's very, very loose. Because if I make it too tight, there won't be enough yarn to get dye on it. I want it to be dyed, just not... just not as dyed as it would be if I didn't do this. Okay, that one's better. All right, now that I've got my yarn looped up, I'm just gonna add them in. And I'm gonna add them in together because I want to make sure, because they are superwash wool and nylon blend, they will absorb the dye very, very quickly. So with this dye pot, it's not a huge deal because there's a lot of dye in there. But if there were less dye in there and I put one in and then I put the other one in, that first one might have a chance to suck up more than its share of dye. So I put them in together. Like I said, with this one, it's not a huge deal, but I'm just playing it safe. And then I'm gonna leave this, I think I usually end up leaving it about an hour. I usually come in and check on it and then make sure that kind of move the dye, water, and the yarn around so that way it gets all evenly dyed as much as I can. Well, evenly dyed from the outside of that thing that's going to prevent it from being evenly dyed. It's a whole thing. Anyway. All right, so it's 1 hour later. I've come out and stirred them around twice, kind of lifted them up and encouraged them to turn over like that. As you can see, there's a lot less dye in that water. And these guys are a lot darker colored. Now, I wrapped them up in order to preserve some of that multicolored lighter blues and whites that we worked hard to establish. However, I find that if I don't untwist them at the very end, they end up too evenly dyed. So, actually that guy's not terrible. He was not very badly wrapped up. This one though, so that previous one kind of came undone when I stuck him in, so he didn't have too much white left. Whoa! But this one you can see has got a lot more of that kind of lighter color preserved. So I'm just going to stick this back in here when there's very little dye left, untwisted for maybe 10 minutes. I just want to get a tiny bit more color on those, and how much I do depends on the yarn. In fact, I'm actually thinking I'm going to pull this guy out right now. Well, he's got a couple spots that are probably a little bit lighter than I'd like it to stay, so I'm going to go ahead and leave him in there. But I just kind of look, and if it's got a whole bunch of really light spots, then I'll leave it in longer. If it's got not very many, I'll leave it in for a shorter period of time. If it like came completely undone and everything was about the color I wanted, I would just pull it out. Right, so my timer just went off, which means that it should be time to remove these entirely. So as you can see, I hope, it's starting to get darker outside, so I hope you can see that there is still some lighter colored sections. Ouch, that's toasty. And my stupid tongs got caught. That's the one thing I don't like about these tongs. Anyway, there's still some lighter colored sections, but overall, pretty good. Nice mottled blue, I like it. Right, now, all right, now for my other two skeins. I'm not particularly worried about the fact that there's still a little blue in this water. It's not very much, and these skeins generally pick up as much blue as they can, so there'll probably be a little bit more left over after I get done with this one. So I poured in the blue that I needed. I don't need to add more citric acid because the amount of acid doesn't decrease. So even though I'm doing multiple skeins, it'll still be the same amount of acid in there. All right, here's my next set. Like I said, putting them in together, gonna let them go. All right, so it's actually the next day. I ended up stopping after my second round of yarn had gone through its second dye bath because it was getting cold and dark out here. And I just threw all 4 skeins of yarn into the dye bath and turned everything off and let it cool down overnight so that way it could absorb the last tiny bits of dye that were in that dye bath. And now I'm gonna pull it out and get started with the next step. Now I'm gonna get some warm water in here to have a steamer for later. I'm not gonna just turn it on and heat it up because this thing is terrible at heating water. It will hold temperature nicely, but I use an electric kettle to heat my water because it's way faster, so I'll be back in a bit. All right, now I have my shower curtain liner pieces that I'm gonna use to wrap my yarn after I've hand painted it. I use shower curtain liner pieces instead of plastic wrap, which a lot of people use because the shower curtain pieces can be reused. However, if you're doing that, note that the clear ones are much better than these translucent clear ones. I got it and it said transparent shower curtain liner, but it's translucent and it melts a lot more. So I recommend against those if you can help it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab one of these yarns and I'm going to decide where on it I want to have a chunk of black. And I kind of want to pick a spot where I'm not a huge fan of the color modeling, if there is any such spot. Honestly, there's not really on this one. So I'm going to pick along here. Sorry, the hot water was ready to set up my steam bath, so I needed to do that. Okay. I'm going to grab my next one. I'm going to decide. Sometimes I pick a spot if I think there's too much light, I'll go there. If I think there's not very much light, I'll pick the darkest spot to go on. I'm just going to fold these ends up to get them inside of my wrappers. They're not going to get touched by any dye at this point, so it's not a big deal. What is going to get dyed are these ends down here. Now, the one of the few dyes that I don't usually measure is my black. When I'm painting with it, I just paint it on until it's the correct color of black. Paint, in this case, means pour and squish. I'm using my 1% black. If I want a very dark black, I actually have a mixture of 2% black that has some thickener in it, so that way it stays put. But for this, I'm okay with it migrating a little bit. I didn't completely, I didn't completely spin these fully dry because I'm okay with this black migrating a little bit. And I just go down about yay far. And apparently my glove had a hole in it. That's just lovely. Fortunately, these dyes are basically non-toxic. So, the next thing I'm going to do is fold up my yarn inside its little container here. Now, I try to do this in such a way that the black stays on the bottom. So that way if it's going to move anywhere, it's going to move down. The dye moves down with gravity. So if I put the new dye at the bottom, it's not going to go and contaminate my blue. Okay, so now I've got 4 little packets that are ready to steam. Okay, so it looks like I wasn't recording when I put these in. So this is just a really simple steam setup. I got hot water in the bottom, I got a rack that's above the hot water, and I got my plastic packets in here. I'm going to put the lid on, and I am going to let this steam. Now I'm steaming it because these dyes need acid and heat to set. And by set, I mean bind to the fibers so that way they don't rinse out. And so they've already got acid in there because the blue dye was done in a citric acid bath. And when I squeezed out that water, there's still enough acid remaining in there that the dye will stick. The heat is coming from the steam. I'm obviously using steam rather than like dunking them in hot water because I don't want that black dye to move. So I'm going to steam these until they are toasty hot in the middle. I usually steam things for around 20 minutes, but I'm thinking it may take a little bit longer today because it is chilly outside and they are this outside chilly temperature, and I need them to get nice and hot in the middle. Okay, it's been about 20 minutes, so let's give this sucker a check. That's not as warm as I would like it to be, so I'm going to give it another 10-15 minutes. Right, another 10 minutes, total of 30 minutes. Okay, that doesn't get hot enough. Basically, if it's too hot to touch, it's hot enough as far as I'm concerned. So, what I'm actually going to do is put these into a styrofoam kind of insulated container, because that way, ouch! That way I get them out of here. Yeah, this is still cold. Okay. These ones on the outside are warm. These ones on the outside are hot enough, and I'm going to pull them out. This one here is a little bit questionable. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and leave this one in for another 10 minutes. I'm going to put these in here and seal them. So that way they stay. This was apparently an old Henry and David container. I just found it. It was all good. That way they stay warm. Because, for example, when I pull this out, it's not going to have been warm for very long. And I want it to stay warm for long enough to make sure that it's set. So just for extra insurance, I like to put them in that container. That also lets me pull them out of here as soon as possible, so that if I need to dye more, I've got this ready to go and I can put more in right away. Or if I'm done, I can turn this off so I don't have anything running and leave them to sit. gonna leave these to sit and stay warm for, well, until I get back from errands, and then I'll let them out and let them come to room temperature. First thing I'm gonna do when I get my own dye studio is install a rinsing sink, so that way I don't have to choose between washing out my bathtub and washing out my kitchen sink every time I have to do yarn. So, with that being said, it is now time to rinse the Blue Morpho yarn. I have the packets that they were dyed in, and I'm going to run, they've come down to room temperature. I'm going to run some lukewarm water into my tub along with some Synthropol. It's a unscented textile detergent, and I am going to rinse the yarn. So the spot where there's most likely to be excess dye is this end where the black was. So when I pull these guys out, I'm going to do so carefully so that I don't pull the blue yarn past that spot where there might be some excess dye. Also going to grab, alrighty, so there's this one. I'm just going to set this right here for a second and do another one. I'm going to rinse two of them at a time just for speed. Okay. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to dunk this black, because that hand painted section is the one that's most likely to have color coming off of it. And it looks like there is a little bit of color coming off of it, although it looks pretty blue, so it's not a lot. I'm going to go ahead and put everything in. If a whole lot of color were coming off, I would wait to put the blue in until I'd gotten most of that other color off. However, it actually looks like it's mostly blue that's coming off, so. Blue is prone to doing that for whatever reason. And I did have a lot of blue on there. Okay. The other thing I like to be careful of is I want to keep my yarn, okay, you can't see. Alright, so I like to keep this part and use it to dunk the yarn. And then I'll kind of make sure that this bit isn't tangled in anything and kind of move it down a ways and twist the skein and dunk it, because I find that helps keep the skein in good condition without anything overlapping too much. Or overlapping, without the skein itself getting tangled. And then over on this guy, okay, so now I'm going to leave that to sit for, 15 minutes or so, come back, see how much dye I've gotten out of it, and repeat until I'm not getting any more dye out of it. And you don't need to see all of that process, probably, so I'll probably bring you back when it is fully rinsed. Alright, so this is how my skeins come out after they are dried. These have already been neatened up, so I was taking pictures of them, so I needed to find the neatest ones to take pictures of. But what I'll typically do is put them over my hands and kind of bounce them a couple of times, and that just gets any strands that are out of alignment from being rinsed and moved around back into alignment. This isn't, strictly speaking, necessary, but lately I've been really liking to neaten up the ties that are on the yarn. So when I get this from my supplier, it has 3 ties on it, and they're quite loose, because that's what you want when you're dyeing. You want plenty of space for this yarn to spread out and the dye to reach all of it. However, that does mean they can kind of slip around. So I like to lay out my yarn and kind of assess where the ties are. It's a little bit long to see all in one frame. But you can see I've got a tie that's right here, trust me on it, it's in the black, then a tie here and a tie here, and so these are a little bit closer than they perhaps should be. So what I'll often end up doing is kind of just coaxing this tie down a little ways. And then I'll neaten it up by giving it a little tug like I did before. So now they're in slightly better positioning. The other thing I like to do is shorten them a little bit. So I'll just pull them a little bit tighter here, tie them into a knot. In theory, of course, I can't do it while it's on camera. And this just helps keep them in place and helps keep any strands from getting... So this is the one that the working yarn is going to come from, the yarn tails are going to come from. I'll still shorten it a little bit. And really what this does, it just keeps everything more neatly in place for the person who buys it. So that way if they open it up and close it back up, there's less likely to be any strands that get out of alignment. So that guy's ready to be twisted up. So finally, to actually twist it, I put it on both of my hands, stretch it fairly firmly. I do like my skeins to be smooth and a little bit tightly twisted. Not so tightly twisted that the yarn is under pressure, but tightly enough that it's not like poofing out. So I tend to put a little bit of pressure on it while I'm doing this. I'm going to rotate my right hand away from my body. Well, okay, so at first it comes towards me, but overall I think of this as being away. And I do that about 5.5 or 6 times for this type of yarn. So that was 1, 2. And as I do it, I end up slipping this further down this hand and slipping this further down this hand. And then once it's nicely twisted, I'll catch the middle, bring them together, and then I slip the loop that's on my right hand over the left end. And voila! I probably could have stuck another half twist on that if I felt like it, but I don't necessarily need to. That's neatly twisted up. And because I always rotate my hand in the same direction and put the same loop over the other one, they all end up with the twist going the same angle here. So now I just need to stick a label on them. The way I've chosen to do that is I just have little business cards printed with my business name. There's nothing on the back. And I have stickers that I've printed out with the yarn type and care instructions and the colorway information. And they just exactly fit on the card. It's really nice. And so I'll put the colorway. I usually try to pick a color coordinating pen. This colorway is Blue Morpho. I'd say this one doesn't have a dye lot because they are also different. But when I'm doing something that doesn't have a dye lot, I will date it with the day that I dyed it, just in case I get reports of something having gone wrong with some of that yarn, so I can track down any others that are from that same day. So they're not from a dye lot. They aren't gonna look identical, but this just helps me just in case. I've never had anything happen, but just in case something does, I like to be able to track down if, I don't know, hypothetically I missed the step or hypothetically the yarn didn't get fully dried or something. It's highly unlikely, but you know, better to have it than not. Then I've just put a piece of ribbon through this loop here. This is the loop that I put. That was the loop that was in my right hand I put over the top. I will slide this yarn tag on. And there you go. One fully done, tied up, labeled skein. I'll probably just kind of tuck these less attractive ends in a little bit just so that they're not super visible. They'll be fine and easy to find once you get the yarn. But for the visual sake, for photographs and stuff, I tend to just tuck them in a little bit. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and learned some things. Let me know if you dye anything similar to this. I would love to see it. And like I said, these yarns should be available for purchase at my Etsy store, emilydyesfiber.etsy.com, if you want to get these exact ones. I hope to see you in a future video. Bye.